The book that I'll be talking about today is Alice Walker's The Color Purple. So I have to say that recently I've had a couple of different reactions to a book that I'm reading at a particular time. And I'll either like the book while I'm reading it, but then afterwards not really care for it so much, or the inverse to that, which is I will not like it while reading it, but upon completion, I kind of realize that there's something there to the work. I've gone back and forth between those two reactions to books. When I read The Color Purple, I'm not sure which of those categories The Color Purple falls into. My perception did change. Not sure which category The Color Purple falls into because my perception of it did change. But it led to a lot of really interesting ideas in my mind after I'd finished. I definitely enjoyed it more while reading it. It's generally a very quick read, and I tend to like epistolary formats, which is just a way of writing a novel only through letters. So why did my reaction change to the novel after I had finished reading it? I think that there were a number of subjects in the book that I found to be kind of pushing an agenda, and not so much a political agenda, but just pushing a way of viewing the problems of the world onto the reader, and making the narrator so likable that we have no choice but to go along with that. Now, I will say, with everything that I just described, I think that Alice Walker does exceptionally well through the style of this first-person perspective. It's a perspective that's quite limited because the character doesn't really have the knowledge or the experience or the words to define some of the stuff that happens to her in the book. So you're left with these really short descriptions that feel very matter-of-fact and kind of commonplace. And one example of this is the narrator's relationship with Shug, who is a famous jazz singer. And this jazz singer, Miss Shug, gets sick and stays with the narrator and the narrator's husband. But there's a moment when the two of them, the narrator and Shug, have a kind of erotic experience together in bed. But because the narrator doesn't have these words like lesbian or gay, you're left with a pretty objective description of what happened. Another example is the narrator's sister travels to Africa as a missionary. She describes female genital mutilation just without that term because, again, she doesn't have the knowledge or that term hasn't become codified. But again, very matter-of-factly and without a lot of value or moral judgments attached to it, you get this description that she's written. So this type of objective style within that very limited first-person perspective, I think it's quite consistent throughout the book, and it feels almost like a return to this kind of primordial state or kind of a pre-language state, which comes across, upon first read at least, as very authentic. I should say quickly that these examples I've just named are frequently cited as reasons that The Color Purple is banned from libraries, and I don't have an issue at all with the subject matter of the book. And I'm personally against censorship or banning things from libraries. But if you consider the time that The Color Purple was written, this was a time when the fields of gender and women's studies, or social identity studies, maybe anthropology, and maybe sociology, these fields were kind of solidifying their approaches and their methodologies that we kind of know today as commonplace. It was easy for me to see how this novel was a way of kind of pushing certain narratives that were common to those fields. And the biggest narrative that I noticed was this kind of oppressor-oppressed lens to the goings-on in the world. And I kind of took issue with that after I had reflected a bit on the book. I noticed that the most likable characters in the book tend to be the more innocent ones, or the ones who are most outside of this kind of worldly knowledge or experience in general. So the narrator is an example of this, as is Sophia, who is the wife of the narrator's stepson, as is this African tribe that the narrator's sister visits. So these are the characters who receive the blunt of punishments from oppressor-like forces in the novel. The narrator is mistreated by her stepfather and then by her husband, which highlights a very gendered dynamic or a gendered hierarchy. Sophia is mistreated by her husband and by the mayor, which highlights kind of a racial dynamic. The African tribe in the book is oppressed by the rubber company that takes over the village and tears everything down without much warning or discussion. And that's kind of a colonialist dynamic or a colonialist narrative, perhaps a critique of capitalism. So I found all of these things really interesting, but because enough time has passed since The Color Purple's publication, it was kind of easy for me to notice those types of perspectives or those lenses placed onto the story, because some of those topics have become quite hot within the social sciences or within the humanities. So I do think that The Color Purple is quite groundbreaking in that it was one of the first things to bring these topics up all in a bundle. But for me, because they're all thrown in there as a bundle, it simply started to feel, like I said, kind of like an agenda was being pushed. Now, I do think it's an achievement for anybody to do such a thing using fiction rather than nonfiction or academic papers or something like that. But especially to use it in fiction with such a consistent voice throughout the work. And in the end, I think that this is a case that my reception to the novel is kind of just as interesting as most people found the novel itself upon publication in the 1980s. This book is very much worth giving a try. Like I said, it's a pretty accessible book, it's a quick read, and it does have a lot of really interesting ideas that come up.